So if you aren't aware already, the Orange Pi 5 released a little while ago. It's a direct competitor of the Raspberry Pi, a single board PC. And I gave my first impressions a little while ago when it first came out and I first got my hands on it. So if you did watch that video, you would know that I didn't have a whole lot to say regarding my first impressions of the Orange Pi 5, just because it wasn't really fully baked yet. So since I wasn't going to be the one to start developing software for it, I just sat back and let the Orange Pi 5 cook a little bit. So I followed GitHub, I followed Discord, I followed Reddit, and I saw a couple people doing some stuff with Android 12. So I was like, oh, let me try it out. Let me see what it's all about. So the setup process wasn't super difficult, but it was a little unorthodox. So on the Orange Pi website, they make it really easy to find documentation. The problem is the documentation isn't that great. So you go over to the Orange Pi website, you pick the product that you want, the Orange Pi 5, and then you scroll down and you can see the software that's available for that hardware device. So there's a ton of different images that you can download. They host them on a Google Drive. Do what you will with that information. So when you go and download Android 12, you can't just install it onto your SD card and it work using a system like the Raspberry Pi Imager. They actually have a little tools section on their Google Drive where you can go in and download some of the tools to help you along the way. And one of those tools is the Android Imager. So you go there, you download their actual tool that they've created to help you make images for your SD card so they can boot to the Android operating systems that they offer. And when you open the tool, you're greeted with a Chinese menu, and you have to, find the way to translate it. It's just one button on there. It's not like super complicated, but you'll translate it to English, then boom, okay, you'll select your hard drive. You can format it from there, I believe, as well. Wipe it clean, select the SD card that you want to use, and then select your Android image that you want to install. Super easy. Orange Pi splash screen pops up when you boot it up, then boom, loads into Android. Really good stuff. But I mean, it is a very, it is Android 12. You don't have a Google Play Store. So if you're not super familiar with setting up an Android operating system, from scratch, you might have a little difficulty doing that. So everything, it's touch focused as well. So when you go in, you can get your mouse working. It took me another reboot to get my mouse cursor to actually show up on the screen. It didn't show up at first. So after I got that sorted out, I was able to see my mouse cursor, made things a lot smoother. But you are doing like touch gestures. So you click on the screen and you move it up to bring up the menu. I went ahead and downloaded a file extractor APK because I knew a lot of these files I was going to have to kind of extract and get into the proper directories onto the SD card. An unpacker as well. No, I got an APK-M installer as well. So I went ahead and I downloaded an APK-M installer and got that set up so I could download I could download it and install pretty much any .apk that's out there for Android. But I just kept it to Dreamcast, PS2, two of my favorite games. I went ahead and ripped those ROMs from a disc as well. And one of those was Marvel vs. Capcom 2 for the Dreamcast. I never actually owned it for Dreamcast, I owned it for Xbox. But the Dreamcast version is known to be very resource intensive, so I wanted to try that, the Dreamcast version. And then I went ahead and downloaded Need for Speed Underground 2 for the PS2, and those were going to be the two games that I was going to try out. So I got those imported in there, got them put in their own directories so that the emulators will, direct to those paths whenever they want a game from that console. Then I went and found an APK for a front end. I wanted to kind of make it more of a console-like experience. And I'll link the channel and the video that I got this front end from. It's super nice, it's super slick. So this is the name of the front end. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it. But that gives you this console-like experience, similar to some of the images I've tried on like Raspberry Pi. But yeah, I felt like it was all coming together at that point. So went ahead and got that front end installed, got a couple of emulators installed. So I went Redream for the Dreamcast, and I went and found just the first PS2 emulator APK that I could find on there. Got the BIOS from my PS2 that I had on this shelf earlier, extracted the BIOS. We're just basically, transferring everything over from our original hardware and, emulating it on our other device so we can preserve our retro hardware and, keep that up and running without putting any added stress that we don't need to. We have the technologies to emulate. We might as well emulate if we have the physical copies, you know what I mean? So got my front end installed, and then I loaded up Marvel vs. Capcom 2 for the Dreamcast, loaded up nice, had my box art, primo experience. Got my Xbox controller, so I used an Xbox One, plugged that in, recognized it right away. Android 12 did, and so did the emulators as well. I had to do very minimal setup on getting the controller set up. So got my controller set up for the Dreamcast emulator. So I loaded up Marvel vs. Capcom 2 for the Dreamcast, went ahead and picked one of my old squads I like to use, the Ryu Wolverine Venom combination, and went ahead and tried that out. It was super smooth, buttery smooth. Like, that game is not normally that easy to emulate. I think the Raspberry Pi had a lot of trouble emulating Dreamcast and especially Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Maybe I had a bad ROM, maybe I had a bad emulator. I'm pretty sure I used Redream as well, the same emulator for the Raspberry Pi 4 that I used on the Orange Pi 5. But nonetheless, maybe I'll do a comparison of the two. But as I remembered it, it did not run great. And I think traditionally when I saw on forums, that game did not run great on the Dreamcast emulators, but it ran buttery smooth on the Orange Pi 5. Like, I had no stutters, no lag, no crashes. So after Dreamcast passed the test, I went over to the PS2 emulator. Got Need for Speed Underground 2 loaded up. So first thing I did when I loaded up the PS2 emulator and Need for Speed Underground 2 is I went over to the settings and toggled on a couple of things that will, you know, tax the CPU and GPU a little bit more. Because I wanted to see how it performed right out the box. And this is with no fan, by the way. All of these tests were with no fan. This is just straight raw dog single board computer, just, you know, sitting there. Nothing to cool the CPU, GPU, or RAM. So after I got that loaded up, it ran okay. It was noticeably taxing. I could tell it was taxing the CPU and GPU. Things were seemed like they were pegging out, because I did get a little bit of glitches and a little bit of frame stuttering, kind of going back and forth. It looked very erratic. So I went ahead and just scaled some of that stuff back down, just turned on the frame rate counter. A smart person would have started there already, you know, a stock image, and then they would have, you know, added things on as they went. But, you know, I'm not a smart man. So I went back to the kind of default setting and things ran great. Like, it was consistently 30 frames on the game pretty much. I mean, it dipped a little bit in the 20s. So on the left, it shows game frame rate and it has a G next to it. To the right, it has video frame rate with a V next to it. So the video frame rate stayed around 60 with the game frame rate staying around 30. And it looked smooth. I mean, I might add some visual stuff to it, kind of creep it up a little bit more, but like, I mean, I had no problems running Need for Speed Underground 2. So the fact that this thing can crank out PS2, no fan on it, like just out of the box can crush PS2 and Dreamcast. I'm fairly excited to see what I can do when I get this thing in a case and get a nice fan on it and get some nice heat sinks on it. So what's next for this Orange Pi 5? I think for sure I'm going to install a GameCube on it so I can have GameCube and PS2. But let me know what games should I emulate next for the GameCube and what game should I emulate next for the PS2. Then after you leave that comment, check out this Raspberry Pi 4 retro game project that I was working on. Peace.